What if the greatest trick the ancient world ever pulled wasn't magic or miracles, but a code hidden in plain sight? Picture this: a massive wooden horse left as a gift at the gates of Troy. The people celebrated, believing they'd won the war, but inside that hollow belly, an army waiting to strike. This wasn't just a clever ruse, it was a secret message, a warning etched into myth. And it's not alone. For centuries, stories like these have been passed down, not just as tales of gods and heroes, but as encrypted blueprints for power. What if these myths were never meant to be taken at face value? What if they were designed to conceal truths so explosive they could topple kingdoms? From the oracle's whispers at Delphi to the epic journeys of Gilgamesh, ancient myths are littered with hidden meanings. Kings consulted them like military manuals. Armies marched under their symbolic banners. Entire civilizations rose and fell based on how well they understood or misunderstood the codes woven into these stories. Think about that for a moment. A bedtime story your grandmother told you might have once decided the fate of an empire. The symbols, the characters, even the seemingly random twists in these tales, they weren't just entertainment. They were survival guides, political strategies, even weapons. So why go to such lengths to hide these messages? Because knowledge was power, and power was dangerous. In a world without secure communication, myths became the perfect disguise. They traveled freely across borders, recited by bards and carved into temples, all while carrying secrets only the initiated could unlock. Today, we're going to crack some of these codes wide open. We'll follow the trail of clues left behind by storytellers who knew their words could shape history. You'll see how a single myth could inspire a conqueror, doom a dynasty, or even rewrite the rules of an entire culture. This isn't just about the past, it's about the stories we still tell and the hidden forces that might be guiding us even now. Ready to rethink everything you thought you knew about myths? Let's begin. Consider how a simple story can become the foundation of an empire. When Rome needed to justify its dominance, it didn't just rely on armies, it turned to myth. The tale of Enias, a Trojan prince fleeing the burning ruins of his city, wasn't just an epic, it was a political masterstroke. By claiming descent from this hero, Rome's rulers tied their legitimacy to the divine. Venus herself was Aeneas' mother, which meant every emperor who followed could whisper, "The gods are on our side." And when those words echoed through temples and marketplaces, they weren't just poetry, they were propaganda. Egypt's pharaohs took this even further. They didn't just claim a connection to the gods, they became them. The myth of Horus, the falcon-headed god who avenged his father's murder, wasn't just a religious belief, it was a blueprint for kingship. Every pharaoh was Horus reborn, and every coronation reinforced that sacred link. Paint it on temple walls, carve it into obelisks, and suddenly, rebellion isn't just treason, it's blasphemy. That's the power of myth. It transforms obedience into devotion, but here's where it gets darker. These stories weren't just about unity, they were weapons. When Alexander the Great marched into Egypt, he didn't just conquer the land, he conquered the narrative. By visiting the oracle of Siwa and letting rumors spread that he was the son of Zeus, he didn't just gain respect, he rewrote reality. The locals didn't see a foreign invader, they saw a god-king fulfilling prophecy. That's how myths win wars, not with swords but with symbols, and it wasn't just the ancient world. Centuries later, when European empires set out to colonize new lands, they brought their own myths with them. The divine right of kings wasn't just a fancy phrase, it was a story that justified conquest. Indigenous cultures had their own myths, of course, but those were erased or rewritten to fit the conqueror's narrative. The message was clear: our stories are truth. Yours are legends, so the next time you hear an old tale about heroes and gods, ask yourself, who benefits from this story? Because myths don't just explain the world, they shape it. And the empires that understood that didn't just survive, they ruled. Take the story of the Minotaur trapped in its labyrinth. On the surface, it's a chilling tale of a monster and the heroes who dared to face it. But peel back the layers and you'll find something far more strategic. Crete, the island kingdom that birthed this myth, wasn't just known for its legends, it was a naval superpower. The labyrinth, some historians argue it wasn't a maze at all, but a metaphor for Crete's intricate network of sea routes, guarded so fiercely that no rival could navigate them without permission. The Minotaur then becomes more than a beast, it's the symbol of a kingdom's ruthless control over the waves. And the hero Theseus, his victory wasn't just about bravery, it was a blueprint for how to dismantle an empire's greatest strength, its dominance of the seas. Now shift north to the icy realms of Norse mythology. Ragnarök, the apocalyptic battle where gods and giants clash, might seem like pure fantasy, but listen closely and you'll hear the echoes of Viking war drums. The chaos of Ragnarök, with its sudden betrayals and shifting alliances, mirrors the very real tactics Norse warriors used in battle. Ambushes at dawn, feigned retreats to lure enemies into traps, even the deliberate sowing of confusion. These weren't just stories. They were training manuals passed down through generations, wrapped in the grandeur of myth to ensure they'd never be forgotten. Then there's the Hydra, the many-headed serpent Hercules faced. Every time he struck off a head, two more grew in its place. At first glance, it's a lesson in persistence, but ancient commanders saw something deeper, a warning about the futility of fighting symptoms instead of causes. Cut off an enemy's supply line, and they might find two new routes. Topple a tyrant, and his allies could fracture into even deadlier factions, the Hydra's real secret. True victory comes not from endless battles, but from striking at the heart of the problem, whether that's burning the monster's immortal head or dismantling an enemy's core alliances. What's fascinating is how these myths traveled. A Greek general might recite the Hydra's tale to his troops, while a Viking chieftain whispered of Ragnarök around a fire, each culture finding its own military wisdom in the same archetypes. That wasn't coincidence, it was design. Myths became the perfect vessels for preserving strategies too valuable to write down, too dangerous to share openly. They survived conquests and catastrophes because no invader would think to burn a storybook. And when the next generation needed guidance, the answers were already there, hidden in tales they'd known since childhood. So the next time you hear an ancient myth, listen like a general. Behind every monster and every quest, there's often a lesson waiting to be uncovered, one that might have once decided the fate of armies. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were survival, strategy, and sometimes the sharpest weapon a civilization could wield. Look up at the night sky. What do you see? A scattering of stars, maybe a planet or two. Now imagine seeing something far more profound, the blueprint of creation itself. That's exactly what ancient civilizations found hidden in their myths. The Babylonian epic Enuma Elish, often dismissed as just a story of gods battling for supremacy, is actually a precise celestial map. Each deity represents a planet. Marduk is Jupiter. Tiamat's chaotic waters mirror the asteroid belt and their cosmic duel. A poetic retelling of planetary formation. This wasn't mythology, it was astronomy in disguise. The Egyptians took this even further. Their myth of Osiris, the god murdered and reborn, wasn't just a tale of resurrection. It was a star clock, Osiris' connection to the constellation Orion and his wife Isis to Sirius wasn't poetic license, it was a survival tool. When Sirius rose just before dawn, it signaled the Nile's annual flood, the event that fed an entire civilization. But here's the genius: by embedding this knowledge in myth, the priest kings ensured it would outlast any invasion or disaster. Forget stone tablets or fragile papyrus, the sky itself became their library. And this wasn't unique to the Middle East. Halfway across the world, the Maya wove their astronomical genius into the Popol Vuh, where hero twins journey through the underworld, a metaphor for Venus' 8-year cycle of disappearance and reappearance. Why go to such lengths? Because in societies where literacy was rare, myths became the ultimate mnemonic device. A farmer might not understand complex calculations, but he'd remember the story of the god who vanished and returned, just like the star that told him when to plant. But the real power lay in prediction. When a Babylonian priest interpreted Marduk's will to declare an eclipse, it wasn't divine insight. It was math masked as mysticism. These myths were the ancient world's supercomputers, processing celestial patterns into narratives anyone could grasp. And those who mastered them didn't just read the stars, they controlled the calendar, the harvest, even the timing of wars. Imagine the advantage of knowing exactly when the winter solstice would arrive, or when an eclipse would darken the sky. To a Bronze Age army, that wasn't just knowledge. It was destiny. So the next time you hear an ancient creation story, don't just listen for gods and monsters. Listen for the whisper of orbiting planets, the rhythm of constellations, the hidden pulse of a universe mapped in myth. Because long before telescopes or satellites, our ancestors turned the sky into a story, and that story built empires. Walk through the ruins of any ancient temple, and you'll notice something curious: every pillar, every carving, even the way sunlight falls at certain times of day feels intentional. That's because these weren't just buildings, they were mythic cipher machines designed to amplify hidden messages through sacred geometry. Take Delphi's omphalos, the so-called navel of the world. This wasn't just a symbolic stone, it marked the exact spot where Apollo's priests decoded divine will from the earth itself. The temple's layout mirrored celestial patterns, aligning with solstices so precisely that sunlight would illuminate specific inscriptions only on days of cosmic significance. Now travel to Angkor Wat, where entire walls pulse with bas-reliefs depicting the churning of the Milky Ocean. At first glance, it's a fantastical tale of gods and demons wrestling a cosmic serpent. But look closer, the figures are arranged in mathematical sequences that mirror the temple's alignment with the equinoxes. When dawn light hits, shadows transform the carvings into a moving tableau, a celestial clock etched in stone. This wasn't decoration, it was a functional interface between myth and astronomy. The Maya took this even further. Their Pyramid El Castillo doesn't just house the Popol Vuh, it is the Popol Vuh. Each of its 91 steps multiplied by 4 sides equals 364, plus the temple platform to complete their solar year. During equinoxes, shadows slither down the stairs like Kukulkan, the feathered serpent descending to earth. Pilgrims didn't just watch this spectacle, they walked it, climbing steps that doubled as a ritual calendar, physically enacting the myth's timeline with every step. Sacred geometry turns these structures into living puzzles. The Parthenon's proportions follow the golden ratio, the same mathematical harmony found in seashells and galaxies. Why? Because to the Greeks, beauty wasn't arbitrary, it was divine code. Build a temple using these ratios, and suddenly, you're not just honoring Athena, you're channeling the blueprint of creation itself. But here's the real genius. These temples didn't just store knowledge, they protected it. Carve a myth into stone, and it survives fires and invasions. Encode it in alignments only visible at certain times, and you ensure only the initiated can read it. When Roman soldiers ransacked Delphi, they took the gold but missed the real treasure. The temple's orientation still whispers Apollo's secrets to those who know how to listen. That's the ultimate power of these cipher machines. They make myth indestructible, turning stories into stone and stone into prophecy. Numbers have always whispered secrets, especially when they appear again and again across myths and kingdoms. Take King Arthur's Round Table and its 12 knights. That number wasn't chosen by chance. In a feudal world where power depended on loyalty, 12 mirrored the divisions of land, the cycles of the moon, even the apostles of the Christian faith Arthur's legend would later inspire. The table itself, a perfect circle with no head, promised equality, but the number 12, that was the hidden architecture of control. Just like 12 jurors in a trial or 12 hours on a clock, it reinforced a system where order was sacred. Now cross continents to ancient India, where sages spoke of 330 million gods. At first glance, it sounds like poetic exaggeration until you recognize the precision beneath it. In Vedic mathematics, 330 million isn't just a figure, it's a cosmic equation. It represents the infinite expressed through the tangible, a way to make the unfathomable divine feel approachable. By assigning such a specific number, the mythmakers gave devotees a ladder to climb toward understanding, one rung at a time. But perhaps the most striking example lies in China's Forbidden City. Walk its pathways and you'll find 9 dragons coiled on walls, woven into robes, even hidden in roof tiles. 9, the ultimate Yong number, unbreakable and imperial. Why? Because in Chinese cosmology, odd numbers are dynamic, and 9 is 3 multiplied by itself, the ultimate symbol of celestial power. When an emperor surrounded himself with 9s, he wasn't just decorating, he was broadcasting an unshakable truth. His rule was woven into the fabric of the universe itself. These numerical codes did more than decorate myths, they built mental frameworks. A farmer might not grasp the intricacies of tax systems or military logistics, but he understood 12 months, 12 tribes, 12 labors of Hercules. Numbers became the silent enforcers of social contracts, turning abstract governance into something as natural as the seasons. And the brilliance, unlike laws carved in stone, these numerical myths adapted. The same number 12 could justify Arthur's knights, Christ's disciples, or the zodiac signs, each culture finding its own reflection in the pattern. So the next time you encounter a recurring number in myth, ask not just what it represents, but how it functioned, because these weren't random digits. They were the hidden gears turning the machinery of ancient power, convincing kingdoms to kneel not to swords but to symbols. A lion isn't just a lion when it's carved onto a king's seal. In the ancient world, animal symbols were the ultimate diplomatic language, a silent negotiation between empires. Take the Persian griffin, that fierce hybrid of eagle and lion. When Persian envoys presented gifts adorned with this creature to neighboring kingdoms, they weren't just sharing art, they were telegraphing a message. We are watchful as the eagle, strong as the lion, and we recognize those same traits in you. It was a compliment wrapped in a threat, a way to say alliance or consequences without uttering a word. Now flip the script. When Rome needed to rally its citizens against Carthage, it didn't just attack their armies, it attacked their symbols. Carthage's sacred horses, revered in their myths, suddenly became monstrous in Roman propaganda. Temples displayed paintings of these noble creatures trampling Roman children, transforming a cultural icon into a villain overnight. This wasn't just slander, it was psychological warfare. Demean the symbol, and you demean the people who worship it. Make their sacred animal a monster, and war becomes holy duty. Across the ocean, the Aztecs played the same game but with feathers. When their emperor received ambassadors, he'd present them with cloaks embroidered with eagles. Not just any eagles, though these were Huitzil, the sacred birds that carried warriors' souls to the sun god. To accept the cloak was to acknowledge a shared destiny. Refuse it, that wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration that your people didn't belong to the cosmic order the Aztecs claimed to uphold. The brilliance of this system lay in its deniability. Unlike a written treaty, these symbols could always be reinterpreted. A Chinese dragon carved on a diplomatic gift might mean, "We see you as equals to one ruler and we claim heaven's mandate over you to another." That ambiguity wasn't a flaw, it was the point. Like modern diplomats speaking in carefully crafted platitudes, ancient leaders used animal codes to say everything and nothing at once. But perhaps the most cunning twist, these symbols traveled farther than any ambassador. A Phoenician trader's amulet featuring a griffin might end up in a Greek marketplace, subtly shifting perceptions before the first battle cry. A single Aztec featherwork traded along Mesoamerican routes could spread imperial ideology faster than any army. In a world without newspapers or radios, myths became the ultimate propaganda machine, whispering alliances and hostilities across continents, one sacred animal at a time. Imagine standing in the shadow of Delphi's temple, the air thick with incense, as a priestess utters words that could make or break an empire. Her voice trembles, her eyes roll back, but every gasp, every pause is as calculated as a general's battle plan. The famous prophecy that a wooden wall will save Athens wasn't just mystical mumbo-jumbo. It was a masterclass in political maneuvering. When the Persian fleet threatened Greece, the oracle's vague words gave Athenian leaders exactly what they needed: divine cover for their naval strategy. Build ships, not barricades, and suddenly the wooden wall becomes a fleet. Lose the battle, the priests could shrug. You misinterpreted the gods. Win, the oracle gets the credit. This wasn't unique to Delphi. In Rome, the Sibylline books, ancient texts supposedly containing fate's blueprints, were consulted only in crises. But here's the catch: only a select few could read them, and their interpretations were always flexible. When a plague struck, the books might suddenly demand a new temple, conveniently funded by a senator looking to boost his prestige. Need to justify a costly war, the Sibyl's verses would mysteriously align with the Senate's ambitions. These prophecies weren't predictions, they were pressure valves, releasing just enough divine ambiguity to let rulers steer events while keeping their hands clean. The real power lay in the performance. Delphi's priestesses didn't just deliver messages, they staged them. Seated over a fissure breathing hallucinogenic gases, writhing in apparent divine ecstasy, their theatrics turned vague poetry into irresistible authority. Who would dare challenge a woman who'd literally spoken with Apollo? Yet behind the scenes, these temples functioned like ancient think tanks, gathering intelligence from travelers, merchants, and spies. A priestess might not know the future, but she knew which cities were stockpiling grain or training armies, details that made her prophecies eerily prescient. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and the game hadn't changed. Nostradamus' quatrains were so deliberately obscure they could predict anything after the fact. A king's death, a failed invasion suddenly, his cryptic lines fit like a glove. That's the genius of theatrical prophecy. It turns hindsight into divinity and rulers into its willing accomplices. Because when the stakes are high, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword, it's a well-timed riddle. The Holy Grail wasn't just a cup, it was a crown. When medieval kings whispered of Arthur's bloodline flowing through their veins, they weren't just romanticizing the past, they were drafting legal documents in the form of legend. Take the Plantagenets, those fiery rulers of England who traced their lineage back to Arthur himself. That wasn't family pride, it was a power play. By weaving their ancestry into the Grail myths, they turned parchment claims into divine right. Suddenly, rebellions weren't just treason, they were sacrilege, a defiance of the sacred blood that once sought the Grail. Now, crack open Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, and the game becomes even clearer. On the surface, it's a knight's quest for enlightenment, but between the lines, a meticulous blueprint for Templar initiation rites. The Grail castle's mysterious rituals, the whispered questions, the secret feasts mirror the exact ceremonies used by Europe's most powerful knights. This wasn't fantasy, it was a membership manual disguised as poetry, ensuring only those who knew the codes could access the inner circles of power, and that's where the Grail's true genius lies. Its secret words, those elusive phrases that could heal kingdoms or doom unworthy seekers, functioned just like modern classified documents. Imagine a medieval lord inheriting lands he'd never seen. How does he prove his right? Not with dry charters that peasants can't read, but with a story, a Grail legend where his ancestor was the chosen knight who solved the riddle. The myth becomes the deed, the will, the unbreakable contract, but the Grail's power didn't stop at borders. When the Habsburgs rose to dominate Europe, they didn't just collect territories, they collected Grail lore. Their court poets spun tales linking the Holy Cup to their dynasty, making every conquest feel like destiny fulfilled. A marriage alliance here, a battlefield victory there, all sanctified by the Grail's invisible ink. Even wars became performances of these myths, with knights reenacting Grail quests as propaganda before charging into battle. Here's the twist, the Grail's greatest secret wasn't its location. It was its adaptability. The same story could justify a French king's crusade, a German emperor's coronation, or a Spanish queen's colonial ambitions. Like a master key, it unlocked whatever door power needed to walk through. And that's why these legends outlasted castles and crowns, because while empires crumble, a well-told myth never stops opening doors. Alchemy's greatest trick wasn't turning lead into gold. It was convincing everyone the real magic lay in the transformation, not the system behind it. Take the Philosopher's Stone, that legendary substance said to purify metals and grant eternal life. On the surface, it's a metaphor for spiritual enlightenment, but in the vaults of Renaissance Florence, it became something far more tangible, a blueprint for economic control. When Medici bankers adorned their ledgers with images of Jason's golden fleece, they weren't just indulging in mythology. They were broadcasting their role as the new Argonauts, masters of a financial labyrinth where currency, like alchemical gold, could be transmuted at will. The parallels run deeper than symbolism. Just as alchemists guarded their recipes with ciphers and allegories, medieval bankers developed their own secret language. A ledger entry about the lion's share might reference the Venetian gold ducat stamped with St. Mark's lion. A contract mentioning the serpent's wisdom could hint at the compounding interest rates of Lombard moneylenders. To the uninitiated, these were just colorful phrases. To the elite, they were a coded ledger, a way to discuss monetary policy in plain sight while keeping the mechanics opaque to outsiders. Even today, Wall Street operates on this ancient playbook. The bull and bear markets, those terms trace back to Mesopotamian myths where bulls represented rising storms of prosperity and bears embodied the crushing weight of debt. The entire concept of market cycles mirrors the Ouroboros, that alchemical serpent eating its own tail, a symbol of eternal recurrence. Modern traders might not realize it, but when they talk about riding the bull, they're invoking the same mythic forces that once decided the fates of empires. But here's the twist, these myths weren't just about exclusion, they were about stabilization. In an era when most people couldn't read, let alone understand complex financial instruments, stories provided a shared framework. A farmer might not grasp fractional reserve banking, but he understood the parable of Midas, a warning against hoarding wealth. The myth became societal glue, teaching consequences without needing a single law book. The real philosopher's stone, it was never an object. It was the stories themselves, the narratives that turned abstract economic forces into something feelable, tradable, and above all, controllable. Because when you can frame the rules of wealth as ancient wisdom, you don't just manage money, you shape reality. Rome's legendary founder didn't just draw lines in the dirt, he etched destiny into the earth. When Romulus plowed the sacred boundary of his new city, that furrow wasn't merely symbolic. It was a masterclass in urban planning disguised as myth. The act of tracing the pomerium, the sacred perimeter, encoded precise surveying techniques into a story any farmer could remember, need to rebuild after an invasion. The tale of Romulus' plow told you exactly how to lay out streets in perfect right angles, aligning them with the cardinal directions. Lose your architects. The myth itself became the blueprint, passed down through generations like a song. Now, look north to the Norse world tree Yggdrasil. Its roots and branches didn't just inspire poets, they shaped cities. From Uppsala's ancient temple complex to Siberian shamanic camps, settlements mirrored the tree's cosmic pattern. A central holy site with roads radiating outward like roots, dividing land into wedges as precise as slices of a pie. This wasn't arbitrary. By building the myth into the streets, planners ensured that even if invaders burned every map, the city's soul remained intact. Reconstructing after a disaster, just follow the story. The world tree's branches became main thoroughfares, its roots the sewer lines, and its trunk the watchtower at the heart of town. The Parthenon takes this fusion further. Its columns aren't just pillars, they're Athena's loom weights, their spacing calculated from the mythical cloth she wove for her people. The temple's width to height ratio matches the proportions of a warrior's shield described in Homeric hymns. Every measurement whispers, this isn't just stone. It's the goddess herself, frozen in marble, and that's the genius. When your architecture literally embodies myth, rebellion doesn't just damage buildings, it blasphemes. But here's where it gets cunning. These designs weren't just about preservation, they were about control. Circular cities radiating from temples, that layout ensured all roads led to religion, both physically and psychologically. A merchant bringing goods to market would pass 3 shrines before reaching the central square, his journey subtly reinforcing divine authority. Even the act of walking became worship, with every step tracing the paths of myth. Modern urban planners still use these tricks, they've just swapped gods for ideology. Washington, D.C. as diagonal avenues cutting across a grid. They form Masonic symbols, embedding Enlightenment ideals into the pavement. Brasilia's airplane-shaped design, a manifesto of progress, its wings outstretched like a modernist Icarus. The language has changed, but the game remains the same. Shape the streets, and you shape the minds of those who walk them. So the next time you stroll through a city, look beyond the asphalt and concrete. The myths are still there, hidden in the curve of a boulevard or the alignment of a skyscraper. Silent storytellers whispering that every great civilization builds its dreams twice, first in legend, then in stone. Homer didn't just write about monsters, he drew a map. When Odysseus faced Scylla's 6 snapping heads and Charybdis' whirlpool, ancient sailors knew exactly where they were, the Strait of Messina, where real currents could swallow ships whole. The monsters weren't fantasy, they were nautical landmarks, warnings carved into story to steer generations clear of disaster. This wasn't unique to Greece. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean by memorizing star myths where constellations weren't just pictures, they were turn-by-turn directions. The hero Maui's fishing hook wasn't just a legend, it was the curve of Scorpio pointing the way to Tahiti. The brilliance of these myths lay in their secrecy. To share them openly was to hand rivals the keys to your wealth. When Vasco da Gama rounded Africa, he didn't just carry compasses, he carried tales. Arab traders had long whispered of a sea of darkness guarded by giant birds. To outsiders, it sounded like superstition. To Da Gama, it was a coded weather report. Those birds were monsoon winds, and the darkness was the cyclone season. By decoding the myth, he timed his voyages perfectly, outmaneuvering competitors who dismissed the stories as folklore. Even the Krokans of Norse sagas had a purpose. Sailors spoke of tentacles dragging ships under, but what they were really describing were the deadly currents off Norway's Lofoten Wall, where underwater cliffs created violent whirlpools. By turning geography into gripping narrative, these myths ensured critical knowledge survived even if maps were lost or burned. A king might confiscate a parchment chart, but he couldn't erase a story told by firelight for centuries. The real magic these codes adapted. When Phoenicians reached Britain, their myth of the Tin Islands where metal grew like fruit wasn't just marketing. It contained tidal patterns for navigating Cornwall's treacherous shores. Later, the same story guided Roman miners to the very same veins. That's the ultimate power of cartographic myths, their living maps updated with each telling. So next time you hear an old sailor's tale, listen closer. The monsters might just be longitude in disguise. The candlelit meeting rooms of 18th century Bavaria might seem worlds apart from the torchlit groves of ancient Greece, yet the thread connecting them is woven from the same mythic fabric. When Adam Weishaupt founded the Bavarian Illuminati in 1776, he didn't just borrow symbols from the Eleusinian mysteries, he resurrected their entire playbook. The cult of Demeter, with its secret rites promising rebirth, became the perfect cloak for Enlightenment-era radicals. Initiates underwent staged deaths and spiritual awakenings mirroring the myth of Persephone's descent into the underworld. But the real transformation wasn't personal, it was political. By framing their subversive ideas as sacred knowledge, the Illuminati turned dissent into sacrament and pamphlets into holy writ. A century later, the Thule Society took this template and weaponized it. Their obsession with the Norse god Thor wasn't about nostalgia, it was about rewriting destiny. By cherry-picking verses from the Poetic Edda, they spun a narrative of Aryan purity that never existed in the original sagas. The runes carved into their meeting tables weren't decorations, they were psychological triggers, linking modern bigotry to the imagined valor of Vikings. When Hitler later adopted their symbolism, he wasn't just using myths, he was proving how easily they could be hijacked. The swastika, once a Hindu symbol of prosperity, became a twisted relic of this mythic piracy. What makes this recycling so potent is its half-life. Unlike lies which crumble under scrutiny, repurposed myths carry the weight of centuries. The Illuminati's Demeter imagery lent their meetings an air of ancient legitimacy, while the Thule Society's Nordic fetishism made racial hatred feel like ancestral duty. Both understood a chilling truth. People won't die for a manifesto, but they'll gladly burn the world for a story that feels older than time. Fast forward to today, and the alchemy hasn't changed, only the crucible. QAnon's A Great Awakening rhetoric mirrors the Illuminati's promise of enlightenment through secrecy. Modern extremists invoking Spartan or Viking ideals are replaying the Thule Society's greatest hits, mistaking brutality for heritage. The danger isn't just in misreading myths, it's in reviving them without their original context. turning nuanced legends into blunt instruments. Because when you strip a myth of its wisdom and keep only its power, you're not honoring history. You're weaponizing it. Spain's conquistadors didn't just chase gold, they chased ghosts. The legend of the 7 cities of Cibola, those mythical metropolises said to gleam with precious metals, wasn't just a tall tale. It was a psychological lever carefully crafted to turn greed into divine mandate. When Coronado's men marched north through what's now Arizona and New Mexico, they weren't merely explorers. They were actors in a script written centuries earlier, performing a myth that blurred the line between crusade and conquest. The irony, these cities often turned out to be humble pueblo villages, their adobe walls glowing golden only in the evening sun. But by then, the legend had done its work, justifying violence as the pursuit of destiny rather than plunder. Britain played the same game with subtler symbols. The myth of Albion, that misty isle of giants and druids, didn't just evoke national pride, it became a blueprint for empire. When John Dee, Elizabeth I's court astrologer, declared Britain the heir to Atlantis glory, he wasn't spinning fairy tales. He was drafting a cosmic deed of ownership, one that stretched from the Virginia colony to the Indian subcontinent. The message was clear: if our ancestors could tame this wild island, why shouldn't we civilize the world? This wasn't just patriotism, it was mythic alchemy turning bloodshed into a hero's journey. Yet no story was twisted more brutally than the prophecy of Quetzalcoatl's return. The Aztecs had long awaited their feathered serpent god's reappearance, an event tied to specific celestial cycles. Cortés, arriving on the exact year predicted, didn't just exploit this coincidence. He weaponized it by adopting Quetzalcoatl's symbolic colors and sailing ships that mirrored descriptions of divine vessels. He turned Moctezuma's own spiritual framework into a trap. The emperor's hesitation wasn't weakness, it was the paralysis of a man watching his cosmology unravel in real time. But here's what makes these myths so dangerous: they didn't just manipulate the colonized. They brainwashed the colonizers too. Spanish soldiers genuinely believed they were reclaiming lands once held by King Solomon's fleets. English settlers saw themselves as modern Brutus figures, refounding Troy in the New World. When you convince people they're living a legend, morality bends to the plot. Massacres become cleansings. Slavery becomes civilizing missions. The real conquest wasn't of land, but of imagination rewriting reality itself until oppression felt like destiny. This psychological hijacking still echoes today. Modern conspiracy theories about hidden cities of gold or secret ancestral bloodlines are just Cibola and Albion in digital disguises. The names change, but the mechanism remains. Tell someone they're part of a grand narrative, and they'll follow it off a cliff. Because the most powerful myths aren't those we believe in, they're those we never realize we're living. When the French revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, they didn't just tear down a prison, they resurrected a ghost. The red Phrygian caps they wore, those floppy symbols of liberty, weren't just fashion statements. They were direct descendants of the pileus, the ancient Roman freed slave's hat. By draping themselves in this imagery, the revolutionaries pulled off a breathtaking psychological coup. They convinced a fractured nation they weren't starting something new, but reviving something ancient. Every speech invoking Brutus, every pamphlet comparing Louis XVI to Tarquin the Proud, turned Parisian streets into a stage where the Roman Republic played its second act. The genius, it made radical change feel like tradition restored, not chaos unleashed. America's founders worked similar magic with quieter symbols. The story of Hiram Abiff, the murdered Masonic architect central to Freemasonry's rituals, might seem like obscure lore. But when Washington and Franklin embedded his imagery into the nation's founding documents, they weren't just indulging in fraternal nostalgia. Hiram's tale, a craftsman killed for refusing to reveal sacred knowledge, became the perfect allegory for their revolution. A righteous stand against tyranny, with the new republic as the reconstructed Temple of Liberty. Even the unfinished pyramid on the Great Seal whispered this myth, suggesting America itself was Hiram's temple, eternally rising toward perfection. The Bolsheviks, though, took mythic rebranding to its most audacious extreme. Their propaganda didn't just borrow Slavic folklore, it hijacked it. Baba Yaga's hut on chicken legs. Now a metaphor for the Tsarist regime's instability, the firebird's golden plumage, repurposed as the gleaming future of communism. By recasting ancient heroes as proletarian martyrs, they turned peasant superstitions into revolutionary fuel. A farmer who'd never read Marx might not grasp dialectical materialism, but he understood the story of Ivan the fool outwitting greedy boyars, and suddenly, class struggle felt like destiny written in fairy tales. What makes these mythic takeovers so effective is their reversibility. Just as revolutionaries overwrite old regime stories, counter-revolutionaries can flip the script back. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor, he didn't discard Roman imagery. He simply swapped republican symbols for imperial ones, casting himself as Augustus rather than Brutus. Modern movements still play this game. Ukraine's 21st century revolutionaries revived the medieval myth of the Cossack Mame, his lone figure sitting under a tree representing resilience against empires. Meanwhile, Putin's regime repackages Slavic epics to paint expansionism as ancestral reclamation. The lesson: myths don't just explain power, they transfer it. Because when you change the stories people tell about themselves, you don't just alter their politics, you rewrite their identity. And that's why every revolution, from the guillotine to the hashtag, starts not with a manifesto, but with a carefully retold bedtime story. The space race was never just about rockets, it was a battlefield of symbols where ancient gods were drafted into 20th century warfare. When NASA christened its rockets Atlas and Thor, they weren't just picking catchy names. They were invoking titans literally. The Atlas missile, designed to carry nuclear payloads, bore the weight of the world just like its mythical namesake, while Thor's hammer became the fiery exhaust of a ballistic missile. These weren't coincidences, they were psychological operations disguised as branding. By wrapping cutting-edge tech in the aura of legend, the U.S. transformed Cold War anxiety into something familiar, even heroic. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviets played the same game with different myths. Laika, the first dog in space, wasn't just a stray plucked from Moscow's streets. She was rebranded as a Slavic starhound, a descendant of celestial wolves from folklore. Her sacrifice was framed not as a grim experiment, but as the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy where beasts ascended to the heavens. Even Sputnik's beep was carefully calibrated to echo folk tales about singing stars that guided lost travelers. Every transmission was a lullaby of legitimacy, whispering that communism wasn't just modern, it was mythic, but the real dark magic happened on the ground. The Red Scare didn't invent witch hunts, it repackaged them. Senator McCarthy's infamous lists borrowed the same primal logic as medieval inquisitions, the idea that evil hides in plain sight, that your neighbor could be a monster. The same archetypes, the secret coven, the midnight trial, the desperate scapegoating played out with subpoenas instead of tortures. This wasn't accidental. Fear is a language and myths are its alphabet. Whether you're burning witches or blacklisting actors, the story stays the same: purity threatened by hidden corruption. Now fast forward to today's digital trenches where QAnon's Great Awakening recycles Templar conspiracy tropes and anti-vaccine movements resurrect the old elixir of death folktales in memes. The medium changed, but the spells didn't. A YouTube algorithm pushing flat Earth theories operates on the same principle as a medieval priest warning of heretical astronomy. Both exploit the human craving for hidden truths. Even Bitcoin's origin myth, with its anonymous creator Satoshi Nakamoto, feels ripped from an alchemical manuscript, the Philosopher's Stone, now encrypted. The chilling takeaway: myths don't just survive history, they evolve with it. They're the ultimate shapeshifters, slipping from campfire tales to propaganda, posters to viral tweets without losing their power. Because when you strip away the satellites and smartphones, we're still the same species that once looked at the stars and saw stories. The only difference is now, those stories come with payloads. Corporate logos don't just sell products, they sell origin stories. When Apple chose the bitten fruit, they weren't just referencing Newton's discovery of gravity. They were invoking the ultimate myth of knowledge and temptation, the Garden of Eden. That single bite became shorthand for enlightenment through technology, transforming every iPhone purchase into a modern-day bite from the tree of wisdom. And just like ancient myths, the symbolism works subconsciously. No CEO needs to explain that the logo represents forbidden knowledge. Our collective storytelling does the heavy lifting. Nike's swoosh operates on the same primal level. Named after the Greek goddess of victory, it doesn't just imply speed, it channels 2,000 years of cultural memory around triumph. Ancient Olympians prayed to Nike before races. Modern athletes lace up her symbol before games. The logo isn't a checkmark, it's a winged chariot repurposed for suburban sidewalks. Even their tagline, "Just do it," echoes the fatalistic resolve of Spartan warriors. The genius, they never had to spell out the connection. The myth does the persuading. Amazon's arrow isn't just a smile, it's a stylized bow, nodding to the legendary warrior women of Greek myth. The subtext: their empire delivers with the precision of Artemis huntresses. Meanwhile, Starbucks' twin-tailed siren isn't merely a mermaid. She's Circe, and the sirens rolled into one, luring customers not with song but with pumpkin spice. These companies didn't stumble onto these symbols. They weaponized them, turning shopping carts into heroes' journeys where the checkout line is the final trial. Now zoom out to national branding. Countries have been doing this for centuries, just with flags instead of logos. America's bald eagle wasn't chosen for its ornithological merits. It was the Roman standard reborn, a feathered fasces signaling republican virtue. Singapore's Merlion, half fish, half lion, blends maritime history with the Malay myth of the Lion City, crafting an identity as meticulously as any corporate mascot. Even tourism slogans borrow mythic shorthand. Ireland's "Land of 1,000 Welcomes" evokes the ancient custom of sacred hospitality, where refusing a traveler was a cosmic offense. The most powerful brands, whether corporate or national, understand this. Humans don't buy products or pledge allegiance to flags. We buy into stories. And the oldest stories, the ones etched into our cultural DNA, are the ones that sell best. Because when your logo can whisper a 3,000-year-old legend with a single curve, you're not just building customer loyalty. You're rewriting mythology in real time. Nations don't just have histories, they have roles, carefully cast in stories older than their borders. Russia's claim as the Third Rome isn't poetic flair, it's a geopolitical script rewritten for every czar and president since Ivan the Terrible. When Moscow's domes echo Byzantine architecture, or Putin quotes Orthodox saints while annexing Crimea, they're not decorating reality. They're performing it, stitching modern ambitions into a myth where Russia alone preserves true Christianity after Rome's fall and Constantinople's collapse. The Kremlin's gold isn't just for show, It's a costume transforming every speech into the latest act of an empire that refuses to end. America plays its part just as fiercely. The City Upon a Hill wasn't just a Puritan sermon, it became a national identity, with every military intervention or moon landing framed as Destiny's next chapter. Kennedy didn't just promise to reach space, he invoked the myth of the frontier, turning astronauts into digital age pioneers. Even the phrase, special relationship with Britain, isn't diplomatic jargon, it's Arthurian nostalgia, a whispered reminder of Camelot's alliances reforged as NATO treaties. These stories aren't background noise, they're battle plans drafted in the ink of myth and signed with the blood of soldiers. China's narrative of the century of humiliation operates with the same precision. By framing modern resurgence as a phoenix rising from colonial ashes, the Communist Party doesn't just explain its rise, it sanctifies it. Textbooks depict the Opium Wars as dragon-slaying trials, making today's economic dominance feel like cosmic justice. When Beijing stages military parades beside terracotta warrior replicas, it's not celebrating history, it's erasing the last 200 years, splicing modern might directly into the Qin dynasty's legend. The terrifying beauty of these myths, they're bulletproof, challenge Russia's Third Rome claim with facts about orthodox schisms, and you're not just debating history, you're attacking sacred identity. Question America's manifest destiny with maps of indigenous nations, and you're branded unpatriotic, not incorrect. These stories bend logic because they're not meant to inform. They're meant to unite, to justify, to compel. When a British Prime Minister invokes the Blitz spirit during austerity, or India's leaders channel the Ramayana to justify temple disputes, they're not appealing to reason. They're invoking the oldest magic there is, the spell of a story told so often it becomes truth, and that's the ultimate power of nation myths. They don't just describe who we are, they dictate who we'll become. Because when a country believes its own legend, every border becomes a destiny, every war a holy trial, and every leader just another actor in a play that never ends. The Book of Revelation's fiery beasts and trumpets weren't just visions of the apocalypse, they were a resistance manifesto written in celestial code. When John of Patmos described a seven-headed dragon or a beast with the number 666, he wasn't just prophesying doom. He was naming names, the dragon's 7 heads, likely the 7 hills of Rome, with the beast itself representing Emperor Nero, whose name in Hebrew numerology adds up to that infamous number. This wasn't mysticism, it was subversion, a way for early Christians to condemn their oppressors without risking outright treason. Imagine gathering in secret, whispering about these prophecies, while knowing full well they were indictments of the empire burning your fellow believers alive. Now flip to the Quran's mysterious, disjointed letters, those enigmatic combinations like Aleph Lam Mim that open certain chapters. To the uninitiated, they seem like divine puzzles. But some scholars argue they're far more tactical, cryptographic markers distinguishing early revelations from later ones, or even numerical keys to deeper meanings. The Abbasid caliphs reportedly employed teams of scholars to decode them, convinced they held military strategies or scientific secrets. Whether mathematical ciphers or divine signs, their ambiguity became their power, a way to shield knowledge from enemies while uniting the faithful in shared interpretation. Kabbalah took this further, turning scripture into a mathematical playground. The tree of life isn't just a spiritual diagram, it's a geometric cipher where each of its 10 sephirot corresponds to numbers, planets, and even psychological states. Medieval Jewish mystics used it to calculate everything from harvest cycles to exile timelines, encoding survival strategies in what looked like religious art. When the Spanish Inquisition burned Kabbalistic texts, they missed the real heresy, not the diagrams themselves, but the fact that they doubled as resistance blueprints, teaching dispersed communities how to organize under persecution. This tradition of sacred cryptography never faded. During the transatlantic slave trade, Yoruba myths about the trickster god Eshu hid escape routes in plantation sermons. Tibetan Buddhists smuggled political warnings in mandalas, their intricate patterns masking maps of Chinese military positions. Even the Green Book that guided black travelers through Jim Crow America echoed this legacy, a secular scripture of survival where gas station listings were verses and restaurant tips were psalms. The brilliance of these systems, they weaponized the conqueror's blind spots. Romans dismissed revelation as mad ramblings, colonial missionaries saw African folktales as primitive, and Nazi censors ignored Jewish superstitions. Meanwhile, the real messages traveled in plain sight, whispered in the only language power never thinks to decrypt: the sacred. Because when your oppressors believe they own the gods, they'll never suspect the gods are working against them. Deep in the forests of old Russia, mothers whispered bedtime stories about Kitesh, the golden city that vanished beneath a lake rather than surrender to Mongol invaders. On the surface, it was a tale of divine protection, but to those who listened carefully, it was something far more radical. The story's details weren't just magical flourishes, they were tactical diagrams. The city didn't just disappear, it sank only after its people lit beacon fires in a specific pattern, a coded lesson in misdirection, the miraculous mist that concealed Kitesh. A blueprint for using terrain to vanish from sight. For centuries, these legends circulated under the noses of occupying forces, turning nursery rhymes into resistance manuals. Half a world away, enslaved Africans spun tales of Anansi, the cunning spider who always outsmarted larger predators. To plantation owners, they were harmless fables, but to the enslaved, they were lifelines. Anansi's tricks for stealing a leopard's spots or tying a tiger in knots weren't just entertainment. They were covert lessons in sabotage, disguise, and escape. When Anansi wove webs to trap his enemies, listeners heard instructions for creating false trails. His habit of hiding in plain sight taught the art of blending into hostile environments. Even the spider's 8 legs held meaning. Some scholars suggest they represented the 8 cardinal directions, subtly teaching navigation by the stars. What makes these stories revolutionary isn't just their content, but their delivery. Oppressors could burn maps or ban literacy, but they'd never suspect a child's bedtime story of carrying forbidden knowledge. A Russian serf humming about Kitesh could be memorizing guerrilla tactics. A plantation cook recounting Anansi's adventures might actually be describing the next safe house along the Underground Railroad. The genius lay in dual meanings, every symbol innocuous to outsiders, but incendiary to those initiated. The real testament to their power, these myths survived not despite persecution, but because of it. When the Mongols burned Russian villages, they couldn't erase a story sung over cradles. When slaveholders forbade drumming, the rhythms persisted in Anansi's cadence. These tales became the ultimate dead-drop intelligence hidden in the one place conquerors never look, the imagination, and that's why they still resonate today. Because when you encode resistance in myth, you don't just preserve it, you give it teeth. Long after empires crumble, the stories remain, waiting for the next generation to crack the code. Artificial intelligence doesn't just process data, it performs prophecy. When predictive policing algorithms flag neighborhoods as high risk or credit scoring systems silently judge financial worthiness, they're not just calculating, they're channeling the same ambiguous authority as Delphi's priestesses. Ancient oracles spoke in riddles that could justify any outcome. Modern algorithms output probabilities no one fully understands. Both share that critical loophole. When the prediction fails, the blame falls on human interpreters, never the system itself. The priestess could claim you misheard Apollo's words. The tech company shrugs. The model decided. This isn't just coincidence, it's resurrection. The singularity myth, that looming moment when AI surpasses human control, isn't really about technology. It's Ragnarok rebooted for the digital age, an apocalyptic showdown where gods, now algorithms, battle for supremacy while mortals watch helplessly. Just as Norse myths warned of wolves swallowing the sun, today's futurists warn of rogue neural networks rewriting reality. The imagery isn't just dramatic, it's strategic, framing AI as an inevitable force rather than a human-made tool makes its dominance feel like destiny, not a choice. But here's where the loop closes completely. Sumerian priests once claimed to translate divine will through liver divination, examining animal entrails for cosmic messages. Today, we train neural networks on incomprehensible datasets, then treat their outputs as unimpeachable truth. The priest's knife and the data scientist's code serve the same function. Both transform randomness into revelation. Both demand absolute faith in systems no layperson can question. When courts use algorithmic risk assessments to determine sentences or hospitals deploy AI diagnostics, we're not innovating, we're reinventing the God King, complete with inscrutable edicts handed down from Silicon Towers. The most unsettling parallel, ancient rulers knew exactly how myths functioned. Pharaohs didn't believe their own godhood, they wielded it as social glue. But today's architects of AI systems often genuinely see their creations as objective, forgetting that every training dataset carries the fingerprints of human bias. We've swapped golden idols for server farms, but the worship remains the same, a surrender of agency to systems we've been conditioned to view as omnipotent. The real danger isn't that machines will become gods, it's that we'll keep building them altars, mistaking our own reflections for divine will. Climate change didn't invent doomsday, it just gave ancient fears a scientific vocabulary. The flood myths etched into Mesopotamian tablets and biblical texts warned of divine retribution for human arrogance. Today's rising sea level projections echo those same warnings, only now the wrath isn't Poseidon's, it's parts per million of atmospheric carbon. The rhythm of the story remains unchanged. Humanity pushes boundaries, nature responds with catastrophe, survivors rebuild with hard-won wisdom. Even the solutions feel mythic, global summits where leaders bargain like modern Noahs, racing to build arcs of policy before the waters rise. Gaia theory takes this resonance further, dressing planetary science in the robes of ancient divinity. When scientists describe Earth as a self-regulating organism, they're not just borrowing poetic language, they're reactivating the oldest archetype there is, the nurturing mother. Polar ice caps become her fever, wildfires her cough, hurricanes her thrashing limbs. This isn't mere metaphor. It's a psychological lever, transforming abstract data into something visceral. A graph showing rising temperatures might bore policymakers, but frame it as Gaia's pulse growing erratic, and suddenly, indifference feels like matricide. Yet the most potent mythmaking lies in the term Anthropocene. By naming our geological epoch after humanity, we've cast ourselves as both villain and demigod, the first species to accidentally terraform its own planet. Ancient cultures told of titans who reshaped mountains. Now our factories and freeways do the same. Climate change becomes our Icarus myth, with fossil fuels as the wax wings melting under ambition's sun. The difference: where Greek myths warned against hubris, ours elevate it, framing geoengineering as Promethean fire stealing rather than reckless tampering. These narratives don't just explain, they compel. When UN reports describe climate thresholds as points of no return, they're invoking the same narrative tension as Ragnarok's prophecies. Carbon budgets become modern-day oracle bones, scrutinized for signs of impending collapse. And just as Babylonian kings justified wars by claiming to fulfill divine plans, today's leaders wrap green policies in apocalyptic urgency, not because the science is uncertain, but because myths move faster than data. The real power of these climate myths, they're flexible enough to serve any agenda. Environmentalists wield Gaia as a call to reverence, while tech billionaires spin the Anthropocene as a challenge to colonize Mars. Both sides are playing the same game ancient priests did, dressing necessity in the robes of destiny. Because when you're not just fixing pipes but saving creation itself, compromise becomes heresy, and dissent feels like sacrilege. The stakes may be new, but the script is eternal humanity, once again staring into the abyss and seeing its own reflection. Scrolling through your feed, you've probably laughed at a zodiac meme or rolled your eyes at someone blaming Mercury retrograde for their bad day. But here's the twist, those aren't just jokes or quirky beliefs. They're modern myths in action, operating with the same psychological force as the stories that once guided empires. Take the Karen phenomenon. A middle-aged woman demanding to speak to the manager isn't just a viral trope. She's a digital age harpy, a cautionary tale about entitlement that spreads faster than any ancient bard could have imagined. Or consider how online communities like incels reframe their isolation as a hero's curse, casting themselves as tragic figures in a cosmic injustice narrative. These aren't random trends, they're mythic patterns repeating, proving that humanity hasn't stopped telling sacred stories, we've just moved them from campfires to comment sections. The real power lies in recognition. Ancient priests scrutinized bird flights and sacrificial entrails for hidden messages. Today, we decode viral narratives and algorithmic patterns. When a conspiracy theory spreads like wildfire, it's not because the logic is airtight. It's because it taps into the same archetypes that made Odysseus' journey resonate. The lone truth seeker battling a shadowy elite, that's Theseus in the Labyrinth, updated for the age of deep state paranoia. The difference is where myths once united cultures, today's fractured digital legends often divide. But the tools to navigate them haven't changed. Spotting the mythic scaffolding behind a trending hashtag or political slogan lets you separate substance from symbolic resonance, to see when you're being persuaded by story, not facts. Start with the characters. Every enduring myth has its heroes, villains, and tricksters, and so does your timeline. The billionaire savior promising Mars colonies. That's the returning king archetype, the Arthurian ruler who'll lead us to a golden age. The faceless bureaucrat destroying freedoms, a modern hydra, its many heads representing whatever institution the storyteller hates. Even memes follow this script. The distracted boyfriend template isn't just funny. It's a 3-act tragedy in one image, complete with temptation, betrayal, and consequences. By naming these roles, you disarm their subconscious pull. Next, listen for the rhythms. Myths thrive on repetition, the 3 trials, the 7 labors, the 40 days in the wilderness. Modern narratives use the same beats. Notice how every scandal unfolds in predictable cycles. The shocking reveal, the righteous outrage, the ritual apology, the eventual backlash to the backlash. Social platforms amplify this cadence, turning news into folklore before the facts can catch up. When you recognize the pattern, you can pause before joining the chorus. Finally, track the symbols. A red hat isn't just headwear. A raised fist isn't just a gesture. Like the golden apples of the Hesperides or Thor's hammer, they carry weight beyond their physical form. Modern iconography moves at lightning speed, but the rules of symbolic contagion, where touching or wearing something transfers its essence, remain unchanged from ancient talismans. Ask yourself, what invisible qualities is this object or image meant to transfer? Who benefits from that association? The goal isn't to dismiss modern myths as silly or manipulative. It's to engage with them consciously, to appreciate their power without being puppeted by it. Because whether carved on temple walls or trending on X, these stories shape reality. The priests and kings knew it, now you do too. Want to spot mythic codes in today's headlines? Start with the numbers. When a news story obsessively repeats figures like 3, 7, or 12, whether it's 3 waves of the pandemic or 7 key economic indicators, you're not just seeing journalism. You're witnessing numerology in action. These aren't random digits, they're psychological anchors, tapping into the same symbolic weight that made 12 Olympians or 3 fates resonate for millennia. Watch how financial reports frame market cycles as natural phases, echoing the ancient wheel of fortune. Notice how political speeches cluster promises in threes, mirroring the rule of 3 that structured everything from Celtic triads to Christian holy trinities. The numbers haven't changed, only the spreadsheets they're written on. Then there's the mythic rebranding of leaders. Every time a politician gets compared to Churchill or Lincoln, ask, what story are they trying to hitch themselves to? Churchill wasn't just a wartime leader, he's been molded into the archetype of the indomitable underdog, the lone voice warning against danger. When a modern figure invokes that image, they're not borrowing credibility, they're auditioning for a role in an existing legend. The same goes for revolutionary comparisons. Call someone the new Che Guevara, and suddenly their protests aren't just political acts, they're chapters in an epic. These labels aren't compliments, they're casting decisions for narratives meant to outlive policy debates. Corporate mascots offer even clearer clues. The roaring lion on a bank logo isn't there because it's cute. It's invoking the same solar symbolism that made lions adorn Babylonian gates and Tudor crests. Tech companies love naming products after Greek titans like Atlas or Kronos, signaling boundless ambition while subtly framing critics as Luddites battling progress itself. Even sports teams lean into this. The Minnesota Vikings don't just represent Nordic heritage, they channel the myth of unstoppable warriors, turning every game into a modern saga. These symbols work because they bypass logic and speak directly to our myth-hungry subconscious. But the most dangerous codes hide in inevitability narratives. When someone claims globalization or isolationism or AI dominance is historically inevitable, they're not stating facts. They're resurrecting the oldest trick in the mythic playbook, destiny. The Romans used this with their concept of fatum, the unchangeable thread of fate that just happened to always favor their empire. Today's version might sound more sophisticated, but the mechanism is identical. Inevitability, myths turn complex choices into foregone conclusions, making dissent seem as pointless as arguing with an oracle. The real skill isn't just spotting these patterns, it's tracing their consequences. When a nation rebrands its military operation with a mythic name like Desert Storm or Northern Watch, it's not just PR, it's activating the same archetypes that once made soldiers believe Thor fought beside them. When a corporation wraps its shareholder meeting in Arthurian imagery, it's not just themed decoration, it's framing profit as a holy quest. These stories don't just describe power, they consecrate it. And in an age where information moves at mythic speed, recognizing the codes isn't just interesting, it's survival. Because the difference between being a player and a pawn isn't intelligence. It's literacy, the ability to read the stories beneath the facts, and most crucially, to write your own. Myths have always been double-edged swords capable of stitching societies together just as easily as they can tear them apart. Nelson Mandela understood this power intimately. During South Africa's transition from apartheid, he didn't just quote laws or policies. He invoked Xhosa legends like that of the Inkosi, the wise leader who listens before acting. These stories became bridges, transforming a fractured nation's cultural memory into a shared foundation for reconciliation. Contrast that with the blood libel myths of medieval Europe, where baseless tales of Jewish rituals fueled centuries of violence. The same narrative tools that healed one society were weaponized to demonize another. The real danger lies in the casting. Every myth assigns roles: heroes, villains, chosen ones, outsiders, and once you accept your part, the script writes itself. Ancient empires rarely questioned their own starring positions. Rome saw itself as the civilizing hero, Carthage as the monstrous antagonist. Today, we face subtler but equally potent typecasting. When political movements frame themselves as righteous rebels battling a corrupt, deep state, or corporations position their founders as modern Prometheuses stealing fire for humanity, they're not just telling stories. They're recruiting us as extras in their epics, often without our conscious consent. Modern mythmaking moves faster and cuts deeper. Social media algorithms amplify archetypes at lightning speed, turning complex issues into stark battles between light and darkness. A protest isn't just a protest, it's either a heroic stand or a chaotic riot, depending on which mythological lens gets shared most widely. The problem isn't the stories themselves, it's the lack of awareness that we're living inside them. Ancient Athenians at least knew they were performing Dionysian rituals. Today, we often mistake mythic narratives for objective reality. Breaking the cycle starts with spotting the scaffolding. When a leader's biography suddenly emphasizes childhood hardships mirroring a cultural hero's journey, or when a brand's origin story leans heavily on against all odds tropes, we're not hearing history, we're hearing myth-making in real time. The test is simple. Does this narrative leave room for nuance, or does it demand absolute villains and flawless heroes? True progress lies in embracing stories that acknowledge complexity, like the Zulu concept of Ubuntu, which frames humanity as an interconnected web rather than a hierarchy of winners and losers. The irony: those who wield myths most responsibly are often the least theatrical. Finland's WW2 resistance didn't cast themselves as legendary heroes. They modeled their strategy on the Kaleva's quiet, stubborn wisdom of survival. Maori activists today revive ancestral navigation myths not to glorify conquest, but to teach sustainable stewardship. These are the antidotes to manipulative mythmaking, stories that empower without intoxicating, that remember their own artifice even as they inspire. Because the most ethical myths aren't those that place us at the center of the universe, but those that remind us we're threads in a much larger tapestry.